Hello, welcome to the Rare Books Department at the J. Willard Marriott Library, the University of Utah. My name is Louise Poulton. Books capture the intangible, the mind and heart of mankind, the best and, sadly, the worst that man has to offer, in a tangible physical form. When we think of books, we tend to think about the words they contain. But books are more than words. Books give structure to words and ideas. For centuries, humans have been developing ways to give words a home, a place where they can be stored, read, stored again, and read again. The written word and the physical form in which words are stored are social constructs. In this virtual visit to Rare Books, we'll look at a few books that represent, in physical form, a need, across cultures, to talk to each other and to continue that conversation over generations, time, and geography. Many early written documents tend to be, at first glance, rather mundane. Lists, receipts, financial transactions, that sort of thing. But certainly these kinds of documents represent interactions between one person and another. They can tell us much about society during their day. This is a receipt for grain, a clay tablet that has survived since it was created in about 2045 BCE. The tablet contains 8 lines of Sumerian cuneiform, 6 on one side, 2 on the reverse. The tablet records an amount of grain issued from a mill by an official named Arad and received by another official, Hermes, whose title is beer libator. This title was used specifically for an official who performed libations during the funerary banquet for deceased rulers. From this tiny receipt, along with other surviving clay tablets, we can discover that, during their day, banquets were held in honor of the dead, specifically rulers or priests and priestesses, that several people were involved in putting these banquets together, that beer was served at these banquets, and that names of people were identifiers. Here, Arad and Hermes worked together to provide for a gathering, and that human interactions often involved the exchange of goods, services, and money. It seems fitting that we are demonstrating the size of this tablet by setting it next to a penny. Here is another receipt, written more than 2,000 years later, sometime during the 6th century CE in the same part of the world. It too is a receipt for grain. Roughly translated, it says, to the Abba of the monastery in the hamlet of Neclaman, Joseph, son of Heremias, comarch of the village, greetings. I have been paid by you for grain with gold, and for your security I have issued to you this receipt as above written. It is signed by someone named Mazor. This receipt is written on papyrus, and instead of being inscribed by applying pressure into the writing surface, as was the receipt for the grain for beer, it is written using ink with a quill. The support, that is, the material upon which the words are written, has changed, as has the means in which the words are written, a pen instead of a stylus, and a substance has been added to the writing procedure, that is, ink. All of this produces a document that looks and feels different than the tablet. It is lighter and, although still small, slightly larger, and holds, therefore, more information. But the social exchange is essentially the same. We learn that in a small town there was a monastery headed by a man named Joseph, who bought grain from a man named Mazor with gold. Information given on the clay tablet doesn't exist in this receipt. We don't know what the grain was used for. These 2 tablets, created around 1900-1700 BCE, are duplicates of many others. To date, 174 of these duplicates have been uncovered. Some are written on small clay formed as cones, others on stone or clay formed as tablets, such as these. They were all intended as foundation deposits, and were immured in the walls of a royal palace in great numbers. The palace was situated in URUK, one of the oldest cities of Sumer. The tablets state, SIN-KASHID, mighty man, king of URUK, king of Ammanum, built his royal palace, or a palace for his kingship. The Ammanum were a tribe of West Semitic Amorite-speaking nomads who had come into southern Mesopotamia several centuries before SIN-KASHID built his palace. I think it's interesting that the king in this culture felt it important to keep a document with the building, identifying himself and the building. The use of duplicates is even more interesting. Was it to ensure that at least some of these would survive? Did SIN-KASHID have a sense of the vast amount of time his legacy would survive? These written documents are not signifying exchanges of goods, services, or money, like the two pieces we have just looked at, but they are, perhaps, a social statement even more profound. Once again, they tell us that names were important, but also that buildings were, and so the written word is employed, even while small and buried, as part of a larger manifestation of human interaction, which included a ruler who by definition had subjects, among them architects, builders, and scribes. The need to express and document more than perfunctory human encounters, such as the exchange of grain for gold, was, and is, a human compulsion, identifying individuals, marking transactions between one person and another, marking actions performed or ordered by someone, moved into the realm of storytelling. The Sumerians told and then wrote down an epic that would expand and evolve over centuries. This story, known as the Epic of Gilgamesh, involving gods and men, expressed human emotion, individual struggle, struggles with one another and with authority, including an entity that was more than human. Storytelling of this kind was repeated over and over again, in different forms in every culture, and written down, saved, copied, and saved again, and referred to by later storytellers. One of the earliest known Roman manuscripts to survive from antiquity, the VERGILIUS VATICANUS, was produced around 400 CE. The surviving manuscript contains a series of fragments of the Georgics and the Aeneid of Virgil, the Roman poet whose works were an essential component in the teaching of Latin throughout the Middle Ages. Like most manuscripts of its time, there is no word separation within the text. The opening letter of each page is slightly enlarged. Written in single columns of the elegant formal script Roman rustic capitals, it is characteristic of other early surviving manuscripts of Virgil. Illustrated in a style similar to wall paintings found at Pompeii, small miniature paintings are interspersed within the verses. It is possible that the miniatures were adapted from an earlier manuscript. The lavishness of the illustration points to the importance of Virgil's text throughout this era and a revival of Roman literature in the late Empire. The images here are of Dido on the balcony of her home, waving her arms wildly as Aeneas sails away. Dido then delivers a long lament before killing herself. Dido expresses abandonment, loneliness, and grief. That is part of her story. On the part of Aeneas, the story expresses a need for purpose, a duty to something greater than oneself, and obedience to the will of the gods. Nothing that either Dido or Aeneas feels or does is in a vacuum, and none of the emotions either feel is singular. Dido also feels a strong sense of duty to her community. Aeneas also feels the pain of leaving Dido. The text of this book is religious, but the book itself strongly manifests the notion of authority, both human and divine. The GODESCALC Evangelistary was commissioned by Charlemagne and his wife Hildegard, written by the scribe GODESCALC It was produced in the court scriptorium at Aachen between 781 and 783. The lectionary was made to commemorate Charlemagne's march to Italy, his meeting with Pope Adrian, and the baptism of his son Pepin. The dedication poem includes details of Charlemagne's march and is signed by the scribe. Charlemagne and Hildegard are both mentioned at the end of the manuscript as its patrons. The GODESCALC Evangelistary is the earliest known example of Carolingian illumination, a fusion of insular early Christian and Byzantine styles. The artist used elaborate shadings in light and dark to give the figures depth. The Gospel readings are written in gold and silver ink. A poem compares the book's gold and silver with the stars, a heavenly connection. The script is on a purple background with inframed embellishments. A book such as this would have been extraordinarily costly to produce. The gold and silver ink, the purple dyed parchment, these visual elements express something that is evident even if one is unable to read the text. This is a book of royalty, both spiritual and human. There is no mistaking it. Few people would have seen this book, let alone actually read it, but the physical object told a tale beyond the text, and the tale is one of strong conjunction between God and man, ruler and subject. The written word was important. How the written word was presented was also important. This is still true today. While rulers, their stories, and their books were important, others commissioned books and kept libraries as a way to display their importance, status, and wealth. Some books were, in fact, very personal. The library of the Duke of Burgundy was legendary. It held nearly 300 manuscripts, almost all of them luxury productions. A library of this size in this era was nearly unheard of. By contrast, the library at Cambridge owned not quite 200 volumes at the same time. Belleux was the Duke's personal Book of Hours. A Book of Hours is a collection of Christian prayers meant for reciting at different times of the day. Books of Hours were intended for individual use outside of regular church services. Books of Hours first made their appearance in the second half of the 13th century and increased in popularity until they became the most common form of private prayer book, for rich people, that is. Books of Hours were used by aristocratic laypersons. Along with prayers, they included calendars, sections of the Gospels, and Psalms. Emphasis was put on rich ornamentation. The aesthetic aspect became more important than any spiritual edification that might be derived from the text. Books of Hours became ubiquitous among the nobility and eventually among the growing upper and middle classes. They were often given as gifts. Just as often, they were the only book an individual owned. They were small, sometimes miniature, and always portable. Owners, most frequently women, would carry these books with them, if not for exactly pious purposes, then certainly prideful purposes. These were part of the uniform, like smartphones today. The object notified others of a particular social dynamic. Its use varied, just as the public uses of our phones vary today. Books of Hours were frequently commissioned to serve as entertainment, as much as access to prayer. Books of Hours became so popular that whole industries were created to produce and distribute them. The development of this trade was used as a model for later printed books. Far away from Europe, in Mesoamerica, bookmaking was also robust. Books here were also a way of recording and keeping social interactions as part of a larger cultural identification. This book, produced in the western Yucatan before the arrival of Spaniards, has been dated to about 1450, although earlier dates have been suggested, including as far back as 1185. It is possible that it is a copy of an even earlier manuscript, since some of the information is consistent with non-book material from a period of about 731 to 987. The form of this book, and others surviving from Mesoamerica, is a scroll, coated with a lime plaster to which the paints adhered. The text, in the form of glyphs, consists of the Maya calendar cycles and astronomical signs, sometimes symbolized as animals. One side of the codex contains deities. This is a book of ritual and ceremony, including one to celebrate the end of a 20-year period. From the personal books of hours to books detailing public celebrations, books were very much a part of social and interpersonal action in cultures around the world. The method by which books are produced highly influences social interaction with those books, the authors, and the ideas within. The ability to create many copies of one piece of writing means that that writing can be read by many people. Ideas can be exchanged between people much more rapidly, and the spread of those ideas reach more people at greater distances. Instead of people going to the book goes to the people. A change in the technology of bookmaking in the mid-15th century created just such opportunities. The consequences of that new technology are still experienced today. This is a leaf from the Old Testament. It is from the first book printed with movable type. The format of the pages of this book, that is, the page layout, was based on medieval manuscript design. The typeface was designed after a script used in Western Germany during the 15th century to write liturgical works. The first font of type, made by goldsmith Johann Gutenberg, consisted of nearly 300 characters, including variant forms of letters, ligatures, and abbreviations, to simulate as much as possible centuries-old manuscript conventions. Gutenberg's development of printing with movable type meant that one book could be reproduced many times within a relatively short period of time. These reproductions, duplicates, meant that people within large geographical reaches could look at the same thing at the same time. We are so used to this phenomenon today that it takes quite the imagination to imagine a world in which words and images were confined to small areas and to only a few people. Until this breakthrough, the ability to read and write had been confined mostly to small groups of nobles, priests, and scribes in relatively confined geographical areas. Gutenberg's development of movable type helped make a much broader literacy possible. The ability to reproduce written ideas and spread those ideas went hand in hand with the ability to reproduce images to help elucidate those ideas. Before the printing press, with the exception of a few symbolic images, like the Christian cross, for example, there were few universal images, few likenesses of public figures, and certainly few of oneself and one's family. Few images of other places, other kinds of dress, other cultures, other anything could be accessed. What one saw as one went about one's daily life was all that one saw, and all that one knew. Few images, symbolic or otherwise, and very limited ideas were set into the collective conscience. Printing made the reproduction of word and image possible. Gutenberg's technology brought about mass communication. And let us note that the essential mover of the exchange of ideas, beginning with receipts, was commerce. Gutenberg's choice of the Bible as his first printed publication was a good business decision. All copies of his first printed book, the text best known in Europe, had sold before they were even off the press. The new industry grew quickly. Within 50 years of the publication of Gutenberg's Bible, by 1500, there were more than 100 printers in Venice and 60 print shops in Paris. There were print shops all over Europe, in Italy, the Netherlands, Germany, and France. In the earliest years of printing, religious texts were the most often printed. These were fairly lavish productions and expensive. Soon, however, printing came to embody the spirit of the humanist Renaissance. Early printers found demand for texts in the vernacular, grammars, astronomy, medicine, law, history, travel, and math. This is the first printed edition of Euclid's Elements of Geometry, the oldest mathematical textbook still in common use today. The Greek mathematician Euclid compiled the work around 300 BCE. In 1482, Erhard Rotdolt printed 8 works, Euclid's Elements among them. This is the first printed book to contain geometrical figures. It is a stylish book, with an elegant 3-sided wooden block and a white vine-style woodcut initial, and several hundred small ornamental capitals. Like the manuscript conventions, it is appealing to the eye, enticing readers with its carefully designed layout. In his introduction to the text, Rotdolt suggested that the scarcity of printed mathematical works was due to the problems involved in printing the geometrical diagrams. He then happily announced that he had discovered a method of printing them as easily as the text. Rotdolt was letting his readers know that his work as a printer was exceptional, and that readers would do well to buy his books. They were well designed, well produced, and highly readable. Having a book produced from Erhard Rotdolt's press carried some clout, and suggested that the reader was as serious about reading as the author was about writing, and the printer was about printing. Regiomontanus's Calendarium is another one of the 8 books printed by Rotdolt in 1482. This is the second time Rotdolt printed this work, and the third time the text had been printed. The text addresses astronomical calculation and observations on the problems of the lunar calendar and the accurate prediction of eclipses. Much like the Mayan manuscript we looked at earlier, it contained planetary positions for a particular year. The last 2 leaves are printed on 4 pages of thick paper pasted together to form astronomical instruments. The ingenuity of the instruments demonstrates Rotdolt's technical skill. The text and the instruments enabled the reader to calculate within the book the object itself. Providing technical innovation such as this freed readers from performing laborious calculations, allowing more time for further thought and discussion with other readings about findings. This edition was not only technically innovative, but artistically elegant as well. There are beautiful woodcut initials throughout the books. The title page initial is printed in red and black. The title page is also bordered with an intricate decorative border. Other initials are printed in black and white. Breaking with early manuscript and print tradition, Rotdolt included imprint details, that is, the information which tells us when and by whom the book was printed, at the end of the opening verses on the verso of the title page, rather than at the end of the book in the colophon, as was then the usual practice. There is something about the printer putting one's name to the product, and when that product, the book, was printed, that brings the object closer to the reader. Book production was no longer anonymous, or timeless for that matter. These bits of information added to the dialogue. The humanity in books can tell us much about how readers used the texts, images within, the objects themselves as extension of their tangible world, as well as the world of thought. Readers marked their books. Here is one particularly amusing example of a reader's interaction with this book. Werner Rolowink's Fasciculus Temporum was one of the most popular chronicles of the early print period. The title has the distinction of being one of only a few books printed in this period while the author still lived. At least 30 editions were printed between the first printing, 1474, and the death of Rolowink. It was an early 15th century bestseller. This means that relatively lots of people owned and read this work, and then discussed its contents with others. 5 of these editions were printed by Johann Preuss, 4 in Latin, as is the present edition, and 1 in the vernacular, German. Producing books in the vernacular as opposed to Latin, the then universal language of the Church and scholars, was an important innovation to the social contract printers made with a growing set of readers. This particular edition is expanded from the first edition to include events which occurred since the first edition, such as the death of Matthias Corvinus, King of Hungary, in 1490. Rolowink, born in Westphalia, was the son of a well-to-do farmer. In 1447, he entered the Carthusian cloister of St. Barbara in Cologne. He wrote at least 30 works, mainly on theology, and mostly for the edification of his fellow monks. Many of these manuscripts were never put into print. But this work was, and the printing of this text was tricky. The page layout has a double-ruled strip in the middle of the page, separating the text above, biblical history with commentary by the Church Fathers, from the text below, secular history. Within the strip are 1, 2, or 3 circles containing the names of people, beginning with Adam. Text to the side of the circles indicate length of life and number of children. Dates above are calculated from the creation of the world, 5199 BC. Dates below, printed upside down, indicate the number of years before the birth of Christ. Each page, then, keeps 2 parallel timelines. This edition was illustrated with 9 woodcuts, including a frontispiece on the verso of the half-title of a pilgrim, 12 town views, an ark and rainbow, and a full-length portrait of Jesus Christ. A City in Flames illustrates the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and Troy. 3 woodcuts illustrate omens, such as comets, eclipses, and monstrous births. The page with the woodcut of Jesus Christ is an example of particularly sophisticated typesetting. The figure of Christ is surrounded on 4 corners by the names of the evangelists with quotations from the Bible. On several pages, an owner has made notes. We saw this on the first image from this book and on one of the images of the page layout. Who, after all, could resist adding a sun? But this page, the frontispiece, takes the cake. What was the reader expressing? Was the pilgrim tired? Was the reader? The impact of early printers on the world was extraordinary. The works Aldus Manutius chose to print reflected the great diversity of the interests of his day. He printed Greek and Latin classical texts, grammars, religious writings, secular writings, political and scientific writings, histories, and geographies. The work and thought that printers put into their books in order to not only captivate the reader, but to aid the reader in the act of reading, are components that suggest the interaction among the participants in the gathering and dispersing of information. Aldus Manutius influenced his world with his craft, as well as his scholarly pursuits. He designed and cut the first complete font of the Greek alphabet. He helped design a type after Italian cursive script, said to be based upon the handwriting of Petrarch. This was the first italic font used in books. Well aware of the power of the press, He was particularly concerned with producing books of small format and low cost for the benefit of students. Here is a particularly attractive typographical example of his manipulation of text to enhance the look of the book, of the page, and the ability to read it. Geographia was the first attempt in antiquity to collect all the geographical knowledge available at the time. The author, Strabo, wrote his work for the statesman rather than for the student, and endeavored to give a general sketch of the character, physical peculiarities, and natural productions of each country. Manutius printed the Greek text using an elegant, highly legible italic type, a typeface he designed. He added red ink to the opening of chapters and highlighted those openings even further with an ornamental device. He ended each chapter with a feat of typesetting, forming what are called pendentives, each one a different shape. The intriguing end design leads the readers right into the bold beginning of the next chapter. Books spread ideas and agendas. Some of those agendas were failed by some of the books that were produced. Here is a case in point. This book is the first printed edition of the Gospels in Arabic and the first production by the Typographia Medici Press, a printing house established by Pope Gregory XIII and Cardinal Ferdinando de' Medici in order to promote and distribute Christian scripture to the Islamic Near East. 2 issues of this work were printed. One had Arabic-only text and was printed in an edition of 4,000 copies. The other, here, was printed in Arabic with interlinear Latin in an edition of 3,000 copies. The book was edited by Giovanni Battista Raimondi, who lived until 1614. Raimondi was an Orientalist and professor of mathematics at the College of Sapienza in Rome. He traveled the Near East and was knowledgeable in Arabic, Armenian, Syrian, and Hebrew. He and French typographer Robert Gragnon, who created the Arabic font used in this work, were both recognized for the earliest and best attempts to print Arabic in Europe. This book was lavishly illustrated with 149 woodcuts. They are noteworthy for their clear composition and narrative of the episodes depicted. Despite the superb quality of its work, the Medici Press was an economic failure and went bankrupt in 1610. One of the Medici Press failures was this book. Its intended audience was a Muslim population. Its agenda was to help convert this audience to Christianity, with Christianity's most sacred text explicated with the woodcuts. But Islam had long abjured the use of image in its sacred text, the Quran, to put a face to sentient beings smacked of idolatry and arrogance. Only God can create a living form. For others to do so was sacrilegious. It was nearly impossible for a Muslim to take seriously a sacred text in which images of the Son of God were displayed, and so precisely at that. The printing press may have spread information and ideas, and may have created conversations that changed minds, but not always. In fact, the more that was printed, the more complicated the conversation. Books and the information they contained and dispersed could be controversial and dangerous. They could be dangerous to write, dangerous to print, dangerous to publish, dangerous to own. Our copy of this book is a startling example of these dangers. An early repair to this book's binding revealed pages from 2 other books hidden within, one of which was published in 1524, the other around 1511. The text covered by these hidden books was the first Greek New Testament printed in France. The publisher, Simon de Colline, edited the text using printed and manuscript sources. To save his own neck, Colleen hid the involvement of the book's printer, a Protestant type founder who was, soon after his printing of the book, condemned as a heretic, hung, and then burned at the stake on Christmas Eve, 1534. The leaves found hidden in the binding are from the first Protestant French translation of the New Testament in its second edition. The printing of this edition was completed only months before the Paris Parliament condemned the work as heresy. Yet this 1524 edition, due to its literary quality and profound scriptural analysis, served as the basis for nearly all future versions of the New Testament in French for the remainder of the century. Ironically, it also served as the 1550 Roman Catholic Louvain Bible. The leaves from the other hidden work are from an unrecorded Latin-French Book of Hours with a calendar for 1512 to 1520. This book represents a more successful gathering of ideas and people. First published in 1543, the same year Copernicus published his heliocentric theory, Andreas Vesalius's illustrated book of anatomy introduced the beginnings of modern observational medicine and was to become one of the most influential books in the history of medicine and science. The book's illustrations are important for the precise anatomical detail and are fine examples of the naturalism of Italian Renaissance art. A number of artists, including possibly the Venetian master Titian, created the drawings for the woodcuts. Vesalius, physician to Charles V, was unhappy with the production quality of the first edition and worked closely with the printer of this, the second edition. The illustrations relate precisely to the text. The sequence of illustration from skeleton to various muscle layers and nerves clarified the study of the human body to a degree never before achieved. To the second edition, Vesalius added corrections, additions, and new information. The written work is a masterpiece of scientific methodology and argument. The book itself is a masterpiece of typography, book design, and printing. The frontispiece tells a very social story. Vesalius, just to the center of the image, is surrounded by students, physicians, notables, all intent upon his actions. The cadaver Vesalius uses to demonstrate his ideas is the only woman in the engraving. The very fact that Vesalius is touching the cadaver was startling in the extreme and designed specifically to do just that, startle. In this book, Vesalius is introducing radical ideas on a multiplicity of levels. One of the radical notions is that a physician actually gets hands-on with the patient, something that, at the time, only a lowly barber surgeon would do. Oh, people, all of them. Thomas More's Utopia brought a notion of the people to a whole new level. Utopia, first printed in 1516, is a satire on the administration of Henry VII. It puts forward political and philosophical principles of a fictional, ideal state. The literary form was most likely based on the ancient Greek Plato's Republic. The title has become a word synonymous with an optimistic but impractical social reform. The book addresses societal ills such as religious intolerance, extreme punishment for crime, unjust taxation, and the disparity of wealth between social classes. The protagonist discovers Utopia when traveling with Amerigo Vespucci, after whom the Americas were named by Europeans. In Utopia, there is no war, no crime, and no poverty. Thomas More refused to subscribe to a new oath required by the 1534 Act of Secession. For this he was cast into the London Tower, where he was kept, tried for treason nearly a year later, convicted, and beheaded. This posthumous publication contains the Utopia and a few other works by More, including a history of Richard III, upon which William Shakespeare based his play, and a piece More wrote while imprisoned. More may have lost his head, but his writings survived, thanks to the printing press and the people who continued to read and talk about his works. Thomas More and others referred to literary forms and writings by ancient writers. Those ancient writers, we have seen many times in this lecture, never went away. Literary conversations know no temporal or spatial boundaries. We still read those old voices today. The text and decoration for this edition of Horace were engraved by English printer John Pine, who developed another method of printing. With only the rarest of exceptions, texts were printed with Gutenberg's movable type from the late 15th to the beginning of the 19th centuries. Pine deviated from the norm when he hand-engraved the entire text of his illustrated edition of the works of Horace. Pine was one of the earliest English printers who produced works of exceptional merit with fine illustrations. His complete command of his craft enabled him to produce elegant works with engraved copperplate illustrations, portraits, vignettes, and initials. His work was a precursor to excellence in English book illustrations for the next 125 years. The text for this edition was engraved letter by letter on copper plates, a separate plate for each of the more than 500 pages of the completed work. The lettering was probably modeled after a contemporary French typeface. Pine used a font of condensed Roman letter forms, a la the script for the Aeneid we looked at earlier, for the text and initials. The font has strong contrasts of thick and thin lines, creating a striking spare look on the page. With variations on this typeface, Pine created an epigraphic look, recalling the style of Roman inscriptions. Each page of the text is embellished with a profusion of elaborate classical decorations in headpieces and tailpieces, and a similar classical style in the illustrations and frontispieces. Pine's method facilitated an unparalleled integration of text and illustration on the same page. Never fanciful, as French decoration often was, Pine's more austere designs evoked a sense of solidity in the text itself. Pine felt that only the decorativeness of an engraved book was worthy of the beauty of the poetry. This look was a major influence on future book design. The books we hold in our hands today, even the books that we might read online if we are so inclined, reflect the design and thought of book designers like Pine and Aldus Manutius and others, incorporating thoughtful consideration of the texts and the authors of those texts. This concern for the look of the word on the page and how that look translates the text for the reader is very much a social interaction. Books reflect the society around them, not only textually, but visually. Like clothing, architecture, art, and even music, books are fashion. William Blake was another innovator of book design and production. He was also an engraver, a painter, and a poet. As an apprentice, he learned the fine arts of engraving and etching. At the age of 21, he began a career as a professional engraver. In 1788, he began to experiment with the method of printing from etched copper plates. He drew words and decoration on a copper plate, then etched the copper with acid. The words and designs could be printed in any color. Often he would hand finish the prints in watercolor. Blake called this illuminated printing. He used this method to publish his own works. Always the rebel, Blake attacked industrialization and organized religion as destroyers of creative and spiritual energy. It was his disdain for industrialism that spurred him to produce his own books. Blake believed that the spirit of his dead younger brother revealed the technique for combining poem and picture on a single printing plate. With the exception of making his own paper, Blake hand-produced every aspect of his own books. To help ends meet, he would work on engravings for some commercial ventures as well. It was not until the 19th century, when he was rediscovered by the Pre-Raphaelites, that his innovative work was fully appreciated. The Pre-Raphaelites, a group of English painters, poets, and art critics, was founded in 1848. They set a style in literature and art that influenced writers and artists well into the 20th century. They were interested in detail, color, and complex composition, and rejected late 19th century mechanics or the elegance of a more classical view of the world. They were more interested in nature than in the machinery of the modern world. William Blake's earlier work, hands-on and down to basics, suited this group just fine. In 1876, gold was discovered in the Black Hills of Wyoming. The Union Pacific took advantage of the situation by promoting Cheyenne and the surrounding area with guides such as this, pronouncing its route as the shortest and safest way to get into the Black Hills. The guide included useful instruction for the visitor to the state. After all, who would want to settle there? Unlike many travel writers of the era, Robert Strayhorn was no tenderfoot. As a reporter for the Rocky Mountain News, he traveled extensively, knew the area well, and included thoughtful observations along with fairly trustworthy facts. The text is accompanied by many illustrations and pages of advertisements. This is the first published history and guidebook for Wyoming Territory. Miraculously, the Marriott Library's copy, once held in the University of Wyoming's library, retains its original paper wrappers. Copies sell now for about $1,000. Books and, of course, the texts within tell a continual story of human contact and our seeming need to keep that contact alive from one generation to the next. A little travel handbook to a far-off territory called Wyoming can speak volumes about our need to write and read about the world around us. From 4,000-year-old receipts on clay tablets, to handmade personal prayer books, to lavish scientific game changers, to travel guides published on fragile paper, writing, and the publication of that writing, is a social practice. Thank you. For information about the Rare Books collections, visit our website, where you can read and subscribe to our blog, Open Book, scroll our digital exhibitions, and listen to other virtual lectures. Want more? Contact us.